Introduction. I am James, a prisoner who has spent 15 years of my life in a notorious prison in California. Incarcerated since the 1990s, the memories of those years remain etched in my mind like scars, not just because of the cold, relentless confines of the walls, but also due to the horrifying stories I've witnessed and endured. Within this place, there's a cell that no one dares to enter, yet its lights are never turned off. Mysterious disappearances of inmates happen without explanation, one after another. But the most terrifying aspect of all is not the strange phenomena, it's the people themselves, the prisoners whose cruelty and darkness surpass even the most chilling legends. For years I kept these stories to myself, locked away like secrets in the depths of my mind. But now I've decided to share them, raw and unfiltered truths about this place. Join me in Rainy Diaries as I reveal the harrowing and spine-chilling realities of this prison. A world shrouded in shadows, fear, and secrets you might wish you'd never known. Brace yourself because the story begins here. Chapter 1. The Greeting. I arrived at this prison in 1992, a 24-year-old man sentenced to 20 years for manslaughter. I won't sugarcoat it. I wasn't innocent. A lifetime of bad decisions, a temper that often got the best of me, and a drinking habit that dulled my judgment led me here. The trial was swift. The evidence was clear. One man dead, my hands bloodied, and a life shattered on all sides. They called me a monster, and maybe they were right. When I stepped off the bus that cold morning, the walls of the prison loomed over me like the gates of hell itself. My heart pounded in my chest as the guards herded us into a holding area. Around me, men with hardened faces, tattoos snaking across their skin, stood silently, their expressions a mixture of apathy and quiet menace. They didn't look at me directly, but I could feel their eyes weighing me, sizing me up. I was just fresh meat to them, another newcomer to break or bend. As we were processed, stripped of our belongings, and issued the gray jumpsuits that would become our second skin, I kept my head down. I wasn't ready to meet anyone's gaze. I told myself to stay invisible, to avoid trouble. But that resolve didn't last long. In this place, trouble doesn't wait for you to find it. It comes looking for you. The first thing I noticed was the noise. The constant clanging of metal doors, the shouts of inmates echoing through the hallways, the heavy boots of guards pounding against concrete floors. It was a symphony of chaos. As I was led to my cell, I passed rows of faces staring back at me. Some were blank, some smirking, and others outright hostile. One man pressed his face against the bars and muttered something I couldn't quite catch, but the grin on his face told me it wasn't friendly. I kept walking. My cell was a cramped, suffocating space with a steel bunk bed bolted to the wall, a metal toilet, and barely enough room to turn around. The walls were covered in graffiti, names, symbols, curses etched by those who had come before me. My cellmate was a wiry man in his 40s named Red, his face gaunt but his eyes sharp. He looked me over once, shrugged, and said, "Welcome to hell." The violence began almost immediately. On my second day, as I stood in the yard trying to keep to myself, I saw a fight break out near the weight benches. Two men, both enormous and covered in gang tattoos, were going at it with fists and makeshift weapons. A piece of sharpened metal glinted in the sunlight before it disappeared into someone's side. The man dropped, blood pooling beneath him, and the yard erupted into chaos. Guards descended, batons swinging, and dragged the bleeding man away. No one seemed surprised. It was just another day here. I quickly learned that the yard was a battlefield, and alliances meant everything. Gangs controlled every corner, from the benches to the cafeteria. If you weren't part of a group, you were a target. I wasn't looking for friends, but I knew I needed to align myself with someone if I wanted to survive. Red gave me the same advice. Pick a side or they'll pick one for you. It wasn't just the fights that unnerved me. It was the sheer unpredictability of it all. A man could be laughing with you one moment and trying to kill you the next. Every interaction felt like a test, every glance a challenge. The tension was suffocating. I barely slept those first few weeks, lying on the thin mattress with one eye open, listening for footsteps outside my cell. Then there were the greetings. That's what the older inmates called it, a twisted initiation ritual for new arrivals. One night, about a week after I arrived, I was grabbed as I walked back from the showers. 3 men cornered me in a dark hallway, their faces obscured by shadows. "Just a little hello," one of them said, his voice dripping with malice. Before I could react, they shoved me against the wall and began to beat me. Fists rained down on me, each blow knocking the air out of my lungs. I fought back, swinging wildly, but it was 3 against 1. When they finally left me, bruised and bleeding on the cold floor, one of them leaned down and whispered, "Welcome to the family." I staggered back to my cell, my body aching, and collapsed onto the bunk. Red didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes told me he'd been through the same thing. "You're still here," he said quietly. "That's what matters." Over time, I became numb to the violence. It wasn't that I stopped being afraid. I was terrified every single day, but I learned how to mask it. I walked with my shoulders squared, my eyes straight ahead, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. I kept my interactions short, avoided unnecessary attention, and stayed out of the way. It worked, for the most part, but this place had a way of finding your weakness and exploiting it. The guards weren't much better than the inmates. Some were indifferent, turning a blind eye to the chaos around them, while others seemed to enjoy the power they held over us. I remember one guard in particular, a stocky man with a permanent scowl, who liked to pit inmates against each other for his own amusement. "Let's see what you're made of," he'd say, shoving 2 men into a makeshift ring in the yard. The fights were brutal, and refusing to participate wasn't an option. As the weeks turned into months, I began to understand the rules of this place. Respect was everything, and disrespect could get you killed. A wrong word, a misplaced look, even standing in the wrong spot could spark a confrontation. It was exhausting, constantly being on edge, but it was necessary. In this prison, survival wasn't just about strength, it was about playing the game. Looking back, I'm not sure how I made it through those first months. I came in thinking I was tough, that I could handle whatever came my way. But this place broke me in ways I didn't think possible. It stripped away everything I thought I knew about myself, forcing me to confront the darkness not just around me, but within me. That first beating, those first nights of sleepless terror, the fights I witnessed, the rules I had to learn, all of it was just the beginning. It was the prison's way of saying, "You belong to us now." And in a way, I did. This was my life now, and there was no escaping it. Chapter 2. A Friend. A month had passed since I first set foot in this place, and I was beginning to adjust to life in prison. The initial fear was still there, but I had learned to control it, masking it beneath a tough exterior. The chaotic noises, the metallic stench, and the haunting gazes of the people around me had become familiar. Red, my cellmate, was the only person I could call close. Red was a man of few words, almost never speaking unless necessary. His comments were usually short, concise, and more like warnings than actual conversations. But I didn't mind. Red wasn't the type to get close to anyone, but at least he didn't cause trouble for me, something I deeply appreciated. One afternoon, as I sat in the mess hall, trying to focus on the disgusting tray of food in front of me, a man suddenly approached and sat down across from me. He was tall, with neatly combed black hair and a strange smile, both friendly and somehow unsettling. "James, right?" he asked, the smile never leaving his face. I was taken aback, but nodded. "I'm Mark," he said, his voice smooth and pleasant. "I heard you're new here." I couldn't understand why someone like him would want to talk to me. Meanwhile, I noticed the other inmates glancing our way. They didn't say anything, but their astonishment was clear in their eyes. No one sat near Mark. No one even approached our table. A tense atmosphere hung in the air, but Mark seemed oblivious. He kept talking, asking about me, why I was here, and what I thought of the prison. His tone was light and humorous, as if we were in a cafe instead of a prison. In the days that followed, Mark continued to seek me out, chatting, telling jokes, and sharing survival tips for prison life. At first, I was cautious, but gradually I began to feel more at ease. Life in prison was isolating and harsh. Having someone to talk to, even briefly, was a relief. Mark was always friendly, helping me, even stepping in to defend me when a few inmates tried to start trouble. I told Red about Mark. Instead of being pleased, he just gave me a cold, stern look. "Don't get involved with Mark," Red said, his tone a clear warning. "Why not?" I asked. But Red simply shook his head and said nothing more. I pressed him for answers, but Red remained completely silent, as if even talking about Mark was forbidden. I didn't know what to think. After all, Mark had never done anything to harm me, and he was the only person in this place who made me feel a semblance of friendship. So I ignored Red's warning and continued spending time with Mark. A week passed, and I started to see Mark as a friend. But everything changed one fateful afternoon. While I was cleaning in the storage area, an eerie silence filled the space. No sound, no one passing by, just me and the shadows stretching across the concrete floor. Suddenly, Mark appeared from a dark corner, his steps slow and deliberate as if savoring the moment. His demeanor was entirely different. The warm smile was gone, replaced by an intense, unreadable expression. A chill ran down my spine, unease rising within me. "Mark, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice tinged with caution. He didn't answer immediately, just tilted his head slightly, offering a strange half-smile. "Just checking in on you," he said, his tone light but strangely unsettling. In his hand, I noticed a coiled rope, loosely held. He swung it through the air casually, the loop spinning as if it were part of some cryptic game. "You know," Mark continued, stepping closer, "I've always wondered how someone like you would react under pressure." Instinctively, I backed away, my shoulders brushing against the shelf behind me. "Mark, this isn't funny. What's going on?" Mark chuckled softly, a sound that sent shivers through me. "Who said this is a joke? It's about seeing what you're made of, how strong you are." Before I could process his words, Mark moved toward me with unnerving speed. He raised the rope, and for a moment the situation felt surreal. I raised my arms defensively, shouting for him to stop. My voice echoed in the still air as I struggled to keep distance between us. Then the door burst open. Shouts from the guards broke the tension. "Step back! Drop it now!" they commanded, their voices sharp and firm. Mark froze, the rope slipping from his hand. The guards rushed in, taking control of the situation. I collapsed onto the floor, still catching my breath, my hands trembling. As the guards restrained Mark, his face remained calm, but that unsettling smile lingered, a haunting, unreadable grin. As he was escorted out of the storage area, Mark turned his head to look at me one last time, his eyes alight with a strange intensity. "I told you, James," he murmured, his voice low but clear. "Don't disappoint me." At that moment, I realized Mark wasn't just unpredictable. He was deeply dangerous, a puzzle no one could easily solve or control. Back in my cell, still shaken, I demanded answers from Red. "What's wrong with Mark? Do you know anything about him?" Red was silent for a long moment before sighing deeply. "Mark has dissociative identity disorder. You think he's your friend? Maybe one of his personalities is. But the others? Definitely not." I stared at Red, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Has he done this before?" "Yes," Red replied calmly. "He's hurt people here before, but no one dares mess with him because no one knows what he'll do next." "Then why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked, anger rising in my voice. Red shrugged. "Sometimes it's better for you to learn the hard way. Now you know, don't you?" That night, I lay on my bed, my thoughts racing. Red's warning, Mark's strange behavior, and the way everyone in prison avoided him. All of it suddenly made sense. I had thought I could trust someone, but in this place, nothing was ever as it seemed. Mark had changed how I saw safety, friendship, and even myself. In this place, even a smile could be a trap. Chapter 3. Lockdown. A week had passed since the incident with Mark, and I did my best to avoid him. No more conversations, no more fake smiles I had once mistaken for friendliness. Now, every time I saw Mark, all I felt was a quiet fear, as though he was still watching me, waiting for the right moment to finish something he hadn't yet completed. In the cafeteria, the only place where all the inmates were required to gather at the same time, I always made an effort to sit near the guards. It was the safest spot. Mark couldn't do anything to me there, but even from a distance, I could feel his gaze cutting into me like a blade. Whenever I glanced up, he would often sit directly across the room, flashing a friendly yet haunting smile. That smile seemed to say, "I'm still here, James. Don't forget me." I tried to focus on my bland tray of food, but unease churned in my gut. Everything about Mark, his sudden appearances, the way he watched me, and that predatory smile, made my skin crawl. I knew I had to stay more vigilant than ever. Then the worst happened on what seemed like an ordinary day. It was lunchtime, and the cafeteria was as crowded as ever. The clatter of trays, the chatter of inmates, and the hum of activity created the usual chaotic din. I was eating as quickly as I could, hoping to escape Mark's gaze, when suddenly a piercing alarm blared through the room. The shrill sound cut through everything, freezing the entire cafeteria as if time had stopped. For a moment, no one understood what was happening. Then panic erupted. Everyone leapt from their seats, fear etched on their faces. The sound of hurried footsteps filled the air as people scrambled to leave the cafeteria. One of the guards shouted through a megaphone, "Lockdown! Lockdown! A prisoner has stolen a weapon and is at large. All inmates must return to their cells immediately." My heart sank. A prisoner had stolen a gun? I'd never imagined such a thing could happen, even in a place like this. As the crowd scattered in chaos, I stood up searching for a way out, but the panic only made things worse. The hallways were packed with bodies, the noise of running, shouting, and alarms overwhelming my senses. Amid the chaos, I didn't head back to my cell as ordered. Instead, I looked for a place to hide. My instincts told me that returning to my cell wasn't a good idea. I slipped into a small storage room nearby. The dark, musty space reeked of dampness, but I didn't care. I locked the door and crouched behind a shelf, making myself as small as possible. The air in the room felt heavy, almost suffocating. The alarm outside still blared, but it gradually faded as the crowd moved farther away. I listened closely, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. Then I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the hallway outside. The footsteps were light, as if someone was trying to avoid being noticed. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it would give me away. My hand tightened around a metal bar I'd grabbed at some point, a makeshift weapon, the only thing I had to defend myself. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. My teeth clenched, sweat dripping down my forehead. Seconds passed like hours. Then the doorknob began to turn slowly. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it had closed up. The door creaked open, and light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating the figure standing there. It was Mark. But it wasn't the Mark I knew. His face was distorted, twisted with a crazed expression. In his hand was a gun, and his smile was no longer friendly. It was the smile of someone who had completely lost his mind. "James," he said, his voice hissing through clenched teeth. "I know you're in here. Stop hiding." I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Mark stepped inside, the gun dangling in his hand, his eyes scanning the room. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, willing myself to disappear. "What do you think I'm going to do?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. "I just want to talk, but if you don't want to, well, I guess I'll have to make you." Suddenly he fired a shot into the ceiling. The deafening sound startled me so much I nearly cried out. "I know you're here, James," he called, louder now. "Come out!" There was no time to think. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, guards approaching. Mark heard them too and turned toward the door. He shouted and fired a burst of shots toward the hallway, but the guards returned fire instantly. A scream rang out, followed by the sound of a body hitting the floor. Silence fell over the room. I sat frozen in the corner, unable to move. When the guards entered the storage room, they found Mark sprawled on the floor, the gun sliding from his hand. He was still alive, but severely wounded. As they dragged him away, I caught his gaze. His eyes no longer looked human. They were wild, empty, and utterly deranged. When it was over, I returned to my cell, where Red was waiting. I told him everything, trembling as I recounted the events, hoping for some explanation. Red only shook his head. "You think that was the Mark you knew?" he said calmly. "That wasn't him anymore. Or maybe he was never the person you thought he was. Whatever took hold of him, that part of him with the gun, is something even Mark couldn't control." I wanted to ask more, but Red only gave me one final remark before lying back down. "In this place, James, you'll have to figure things out for yourself." That night I couldn't sleep. What Mark had done and what he had become would haunt me forever. Chapter 4. 101. Since the day Mark disappeared, life in prison seemed to return to its regular rhythm. I no longer saw his crazed eyes, nor did I have to endure those haunting smiles. From the whispers I overheard, Mark had been taken away, perhaps to a mental institution where they use white beds to restrain people like him. Or worse, maybe Mark no longer existed. Either way, his disappearance brought me a sense of relief, though the ghost of his presence still lurked in the shadows of my mind. But in this stagnant place, peace never truly existed. My cell was 107, located at the end of the west hallway. To get back to my cell, I had to pass another cell, numbered 101. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. It was just another cell like any other with cold steel bars and bare concrete walls. But over time, I realized there was something strange about 101. Cell 101 was empty. In the nearly 3 months I had been here, I had never seen anyone enter or leave that cell. No sounds, no voices, and no sign it had ever been used. Yet there was one thing that constantly unsettled me. The light in cell 101 never went out, even when all the other cells plunged into darkness during lights out. Every time I passed by 101, a chill ran down my spine. Not the usual coldness of concrete or metal, but a bone-deep cold, as if the air had been drained of all warmth. On some days, I made an effort to walk quickly past it, trying to ignore the discomfort, but the cell seemed to have an eerie pull, compelling me to glance inside through the bars every time I walked by. Inside, 101 was completely empty. No bed, no table, not even a toilet. But the strangest thing was the light. The bulb above didn't flicker or dim like the others. It emitted a steady, pale white light, casting the room in an otherworldly glow. It made the cell look like an endless void, utterly separate from the rest of the world. One night, after the lights went out and all the prisoners had returned to their cells, I lay on my bed with my eyes half closed, trying to push away wandering thoughts. But then a strange sensation crept over me. The air in my cell grew heavy, as though an unseen force was pressing down on me. I sat up abruptly and peered out into the hallway through the small window in my door. The light in cell 101 was still on, as always, but this time it was different. The light was no longer soft and faint. It had become harsh, almost tearing through the surrounding darkness. I felt as though the light was alive, shifting and spreading through the corridor. And then I heard it, a faint whisper emanating from 101. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the sound grew clearer, the whispers distinct, as though calling my name. James. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. Something inside 101 was trying to communicate with me, or worse, trying to draw me closer. I tried to take deep breaths, convincing myself it was just a nightmare. But the voice didn't stop, and this time it sounded right next to my ear. James, come closer. I don't know what compelled me to rise and step out of bed. I unlocked my cell door, my feet moving as if controlled by an invisible force. The corridor was eerily quiet, illuminated only by the light spilling from 101. Every step I took echoed, and I could hear the frantic beating of my heart. As I approached 101, the air grew colder, like walking into a freezer. I peered through the bars, and this time the room wasn't empty. A figure stood in the center, its back turned to me. Mark, I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but slowly turned its head. It wasn't Mark. The face was grotesquely distorted, the skin deathly pale, and its eyes were deep hollows, like black voids. The thing smiled, a twisted, eerie grin that bore an uncanny resemblance to Mark's, but colder, more menacing. I felt as though my soul had frozen in place. James, it spoke, its voice echoing as if from the depths of hell. I've been waiting for you. I stumbled back, ready to turn and run, but the light from 101 suddenly flared, flooding the entire hallway. I screamed, but no one answered. My body was pulled toward the cell, powerless against the invisible force controlling me. I woke up in my cell, my entire body trembling and drenched in sweat. The faint morning light trickled through the small window, which should have brought some sense of peace, but it didn't. The cold from the night before clung to me like a fog I couldn't shake off. I rubbed my temples, trying to dispel the unsettling memories of what I had seen. The light in cell 101, the oppressive atmosphere, and the shadow I thought I had glimpsed, none of it made sense. Yet it all felt disturbingly real. All day long, I couldn't focus on anything. Every scene seemed amplified. Every shadow stretched longer than it should. My mind kept circling back to the mystery of cell 101. Who had stayed there? Why was it always empty? And more importantly, why did I feel as though something was alive in there? After lunch, as I returned to my cell, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I turned to Red, the only person I thought might have answers. Red, I asked hesitantly, do you know anything about Cell 101? He glanced up from his bunk, his face calm but his eyes sharp. Why are you asking about that all of a sudden? He said, his tone a mix of curiosity and caution. I hesitated. Should I tell him about last night? About the whispers I thought I'd heard? Instead, I kept my voice as casual as I could. I don't know, it's just weird. Every time I pass by, I feel something strange, and I've never seen anyone go in or out of it. Red set his tattered book down and sighed. Nobody's in there, he said after a long pause, and it's best if you stay away from it too. Why? I pressed, my curiosity overtaking my fear. What's so special about that cell? Red was silent for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to tell me. Finally he spoke, his voice low and grave. I don't know much, but my old cellmate once told me. Years ago, there used to be someone in Cell 101. A quiet guy, didn't talk to anyone, but this place broke him. The isolation, the pressure, it all got to him. One night, he decided to end it. A chill ran down my spine. End it? I repeated, barely able to get the words out. Red nodded, his eyes gazing into some distant memory. Since then, no one has dared to stay in 101. Strange things started happening. People said they heard footsteps, whispers, even though the cell was empty. And the light. He trailed off, glancing toward the hallway. It's always on, not because someone forgot to turn it off, but because they won't. There's something in that cell no one wants to face. I swallowed hard, trying to process what I had just heard. It all matched what I had experienced the night before. So, do you believe in it? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Red shrugged, but his eyes betrayed more than his words. I've never seen anything myself, but I know one thing. In this place, anything is possible, and 101, it's not a place you should be curious about. Best to keep your distance. All day, Red's words echoed in my mind. The story he told sent shivers down my spine. 101 wasn't just a cell. It was a boundary, a place no one dared to cross. That night, as I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, the silence around me felt heavier than usual. My thoughts drifted back to the light in 101, the whispers I thought I heard, and the strange sensation I felt every time I passed by it. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the more I tried, the more vivid it became. In this place, curiosity was a dangerous thing. But once it had taken root in your mind, it wouldn't let you go. I knew that 101 wasn't just a number. It was a warning, a door to darkness I wasn't ready to face. Yet somehow, I knew that sooner or later the room would draw me back in. Chapter 5. Vanished. A few days after my conversation with Red, the curiosity about room 101 still lingered. Every time I passed by it, I couldn't suppress the eerie feeling creeping up on me. The light inside remained on, and the air around it always seemed frozen. But I tried to push it aside, convincing myself that it was better not to dwell on it too much. Until one morning, everything changed. While I was standing in line for breakfast, an unusual commotion spread across the dining hall. Whispers, worried glances, it was everywhere. I raised an eyebrow at Red, but he just shook his head slightly, as if to say, "Stay out of it." Of course, I couldn't ignore it. "I heard he's gone," a hushed voice spoke from the table next to mine. "He?" another whispered. "Who are you talking about?" "The guy in room 102, the first replied, his voice tense. "Last night, he was still there. This morning, he's gone. No one can find him," as if he vanished into thin air. My heart skipped a beat. Room 102. It was right across from room 101. "Maybe he escaped," one inmate interjected skeptically. "That's not unheard of around here." Another snorted. "Him? Escape? Don't make me laugh. He's more afraid of the guards than death. How could he have gotten out?" "Some say he was taken care of," another voice added. "Maybe he knew too much." "But why didn't anyone hear anything?" A younger inmate countered. "No noise, no signs of struggle. This isn't normal." I sat in silence, their words echoing in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe this was just an escape or some conspiracy like they suggested. But another part, buried deeper, couldn't stop thinking about room 101. The way he disappeared, suddenly and without a trace, it felt disturbingly familiar. Back in the cell after breakfast, I couldn't hold back anymore. "Red, what do you think about the guy in 102? I asked. Red looked up, his gaze heavy. I told you already, curiosity doesn't do anyone any good around here. Best not to ask. But don't you think it's strange? I pressed. He was right across from 101. Could there be some connection? Red frowned and set his book down. What are you trying to say? 101 is just a room. 4 walls and a bed, like every other place. No, I cut in. It's not the same. From the moment I got here, I felt something's off. And now, with this, don't you find it strange? He looked at me, his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. What are you thinking? He asked, his voice low. I don't think he escaped, and I don't think he was taken care of, I said, each word heavy like a stone. I think he walked into room 101 and he never came back. Red didn't say anything, but his expression darkened. His silence felt like an admission. That part of him believed it too, but was too afraid to say it out loud. That night, I lay in bed, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with vague, tangled thoughts. The cold light from room 101 flashed in my mind again, like a ghostly lantern flickering in the darkness. I remembered the shadow I had glimpsed, the unsettling abnormality I felt every time I passed by. And now, if the guy from 102 really had stepped into that place, room 101, what awaited him inside? What had consumed him and erased all traces of his existence? The questions gnawed at my mind, like dull blades, scraping away the protective shell I'd tried to build around myself. The more I thought about it, the clearer a chilling realization became. Room 101 wasn't just a room. It was something beyond our comprehension, a fragile boundary between reality and a darker abyss. Perhaps it wasn't meant to contain anyone, but was instead waiting to devour anyone who dared to cross its threshold. As fatigue began to drag me into sleep, a spine-chilling thought surfaced, creeping in like a sinister whisper. Room 101 was a door to a place none of us could reach, understand, or escape from. And I realized I couldn't pretend to ignore it any longer. That room, somehow, had started calling my name. Chapter 6. The Harmless Man. Time passed, and the story of Room 101 gradually faded into the shadows of memory. Although it never entirely left my mind, life in prison forced me to confront more immediate and tangible fears. A year had gone by since the night the prisoner in room 102 vanished without a trace. The curiosity lingered, but the monotonous grind of prison life taught me to suppress it. Some things are best left unknown. But then, another horror emerged, a specter not born of mysterious doors or eerie lights, but of the very people we lived alongside every day. Old Joe, a name known to nearly every inmate in the prison. No one called him by his full name. To us, Joe was just a small, unassuming old man. He had been here so long that people forgot he ever had a life outside these walls. With his silver hair, hunched posture, and slow, shuffling steps, Joe was far from remarkable. He lived quietly in his dark corner, avoiding conflict and minding his own business. I had even thought of him as a kind person once. He shared his meager food rations with weaker prisoners, silently listened when someone needed to vent, and blended into the background like a piece of furniture. Harmless, part of the scenery. None of us knew that he was the embodiment of the most terrifying evil. Old Joe died on a cold winter morning as icy winds swept through the prison. His death garnered little attention, a frail, sickly man succumbing after years of enduring the harsh prison conditions. He passed quietly in his creaky bed in his cell, no noise, no farewells. The prisoners around him only realized he was gone when the guards called his name and received no reply. When they carried his body away, everything seemed normal. No one mourned, no one cared. He was just another nameless inmate among hundreds, leaving behind a void that quickly filled with indifference. But no one could have anticipated that his death would mark the beginning of one of the most horrifying discoveries I would ever know. It happened that afternoon. I was sitting in my cell, trying to read an old book Red had lent me, when the noise in the hallway drew my attention. The guards, usually focused solely on their routines, now appeared visibly agitated. They were rummaging through Joe's cell, pulling out large boxes filled with his belongings. I heard a prisoner nearby whisper, probably just inventorying his stuff. Happens all the time. But things quickly escalated far beyond routine. Rumors spread like wildfire. The guards had found strange things in Joe's cell: photographs of prisoners who had gone missing years ago, items that didn't belong to him, and most chilling of all, a small notebook filled with unsettling writings. "Don't joke about it. He was just an old man," one prisoner said as we gathered during recreation time, but the worry on everyone's faces was undeniable. "He wasn't so simple," another chimed in, his voice low and trembling. "Do you know how many people have disappeared from this prison over the years? No trace, nothing, and now." His sentence hung in the air, unfinished, but I understood his meaning. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Joe, the kind, harmless old man I had once thought of as a benign figure, could very well have been the one behind all the mysterious disappearances over the past 2 decades. As more details emerged, the atmosphere in the prison grew tense. Joe wasn't just a killer, he was a predator. His victims were the weak, the forgotten, those whom no one would miss. He had exploited the chaos of prison life to carry out his crimes, hiding bodies in obscure corners that no one ever thought to check. With the constant influx and departure of inmates, the occasional disappearance went unnoticed. I recalled the times I'd seen Joe sitting silently in the yard, a benign smile on his face. How well had he hidden himself? How had he managed to kill so many people without anyone suspecting? And what had driven him to do it? These questions had no answers, but they haunted me, even in my dreams. After Joe's death, everything in the prison changed. No one felt safe anymore. Suspicion lingered in every gaze. Anyone could be the next Joe, a killer lurking in the shadows. Laughter faded and an oppressive silence settled over the prison like a thick fog. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. Was Joe connected to Room 101? Had he ever stepped through its door and brought back some kind of malevolent force? Or had the prison itself, with its cruelty and isolation, turned him into a monster? Those questions remained unanswered. But one thing was clear. This prison didn't need supernatural phenomena to be terrifying. We, the people living within its walls, with all our secrets and darkness, were enough to turn it into a hell. Joe was gone, but his ghost lived on in the minds of every prisoner. For me, the greatest fear wasn't Room 101. It was the people around me, walking past me every day, carrying secrets I never wanted to uncover. Chapter 8, The Group. The stories of Jack, Joe, and Mark had left scars on everyone who witnessed them. They weren't merely tales of the supernatural or the inexplicable. They were vivid reminders of the terrifying depths of human madness. The eerie whispers of Room 101 no longer haunted me. Far more terrifying things lurked in this prison than locked doors and ghostly figures. A new group arrived today. They weren't like the others who entered with hunched shoulders and fearful eyes. This was a gang of 5, notorious for trafficking illicit substances on the outside. Each carried a quiet menace, moving with an unnerving ease for newcomers. Their names quickly spread like wildfire. Carlos, the towering leader with cold, calculating eyes. Miguel, wiry and always smirking. Rafael, his arms covered in tattoos and his temper flaring easily. Luis, eerily silent and always watching, and Enrique, the youngest, his boyish face a stark contrast to the others. At first, they kept to themselves, rarely engaging with anyone outside their circle. They spoke in low murmurs, exchanged quiet laughs, and acted as though the walls were merely a temporary inconvenience. They sat together in the corner of the yard during breaks, their heads close as they whispered, glancing around as though sharing secrets only they could understand. I tried to ignore the unease they caused me, but something about them felt off. They carried an invisible weight, a shadow that seemed to drag behind them. Yet I dismissed the feeling. After all, this was prison. Unease was the norm. But then, everything changed. It started subtly. One night, the cell block lights flickered, a common annoyance. But as they stabilized, I heard it. A low hum, almost like a chant. It wasn't the usual restless clamor of prisoners. It was rhythmic, deliberate, growing louder. I craned my neck toward the sound, and my heart sank. The 5 of them, Carlos, Miguel, Rafael, Luis, and Enrique, stood in their cell in a circle. Their heads were bowed, their hands clasped. They chanted in a guttural, foreign rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Others noticed too. Faces pressed against cell bars, whispers spreading nervously. Whatever they were doing was unnerving, but eventually exhaustion won, and most of us fell asleep. By morning, chaos erupted. A body had been found in the showers, an older inmate who kept to himself. His throat had been slashed, and strange symbols were carved into his chest. The guards struggled to maintain control as fear spread. Whispers of a ritual killing filled the prison. Some claimed to have seen the group in the showers the previous night, their hands stained red, but no one dared confront them. That night, the chanting began again, louder, more frenzied. When the lights flickered, I saw shadows moving unnaturally against the walls of their cell. No one was walking, yet the shadows twisted and danced, taking forms that didn't belong. My chest tightened as I realized I was holding my breath. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. 2 days later, Miguel's body was found in the yard. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. Unlike the first victim, there were no symbols, no wounds, nothing to explain his death. The expression on his face, though, was enough to chill anyone. It was as if he had seen something no human should. The remaining 4 were unfazed. If anything, they seemed emboldened. Carlos, the leader, spoke louder, his voice cutting across the yard. He wasn't strong enough, he declared, loud enough for all to hear. But we are. The guards tightened surveillance, forbidding them from gathering together, but it didn't matter. The chanting continued, sometimes faint, sometimes oppressive, seeping into the walls and into our minds. Then one night, the cell block plunged into darkness. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting jagged, uneven shadows. My pulse raced as I heard the clanging of metal, someone moving through the halls, but not the guards. I stayed frozen, barely daring to breathe. From the direction of their cell came a scream, piercing and guttural. It was followed by another, then another, until the entire prison echoed with cries of terror. When the lights returned, the guards found their cell empty. Carlos, Rafael, Luis, and Enrique were gone. The walls were covered in strange, jagged symbols, drawn in what looked like blood. At the center of the cell lay a pile of ashes, faintly smoking, surrounded by the remains of teeth and fingernails. The prison went into lockdown. No one could explain what had happened. Some inmates swore they saw shadows moving through the halls, too large and too fast to be human. Others whispered that the group had summoned something, paying the ultimate price. The cell was sealed, its walls scrubbed clean, but the whispers never stopped. The guards avoided speaking of what they'd seen, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. For me, the group left a haunting truth. The supernatural might be terrifying, but the real horror lay in the darkness within people, the beliefs they cling to, the rituals they enact, the lengths they will go to. Room 101 no longer frightened me. The true terror was in those who shared these walls, their madness inching closer with every passing day. Chapter 9. Red. The killings and deaths in this prison had become almost routine, a constant reminder of the madness that thrived here. Over the years, I had come to accept that this place wasn't merely a cage for people like us. It was a crucible, refining our fears and sins until they consumed us. I wasn't blind to my own part in this. I was here because I had taken a life. None of us in these walls could claim innocence, and perhaps that was why the prison seemed alive with an invisible, malevolent force. But even in this hellish existence, I had one anchor, Red, my cellmate. For 4 years, Red had been my companion, though calling him that felt generous. He was a man of few words, quiet and introspective, the kind of person who could fade into the background without effort. At first, I thought it was his way of surviving. The less you're noticed in a place like this, the better. But over time, his silence began to feel deliberate, almost calculated. I didn't even know why he was here. He had never volunteered the information, and I had learned early on that pressing him for answers only led to a dead end. Red was built like a man who had spent years carrying burdens too heavy for one person. His broad shoulders and rough hands spoke of a life defined by labor, while his eyes, deep, unreadable pools, hinted at something darker. I wasn't sure if it was guilt, grief, or anger that weighed on him, but whatever it was, it kept me at arm's length. I tried, at first, to break through his shell, but he always shut me out, deflecting with curt answers or simply ignoring me. Over time, I stopped trying. If he wanted to keep me out of his life, that was his choice. Still, despite his cold demeanor, there were moments when I couldn't help but feel a grudging respect for him. Red had a way of navigating the chaos of this prison, with a calm detachment that bordered on eerie. While fights erupted and alliances crumbled, he remained untouched, as though an invisible barrier shielded him from the madness. Even the most hardened inmates gave him a wide berth, not out of fear, but something closer to reverence. It was as if they sensed there was more to him than met the eye. I didn't know it then, but Red's secret was about to unravel. It started with an argument in the yard. One of the newer inmates, a wiry man named Travis, had been trying to carve out a reputation for himself. He was brash, cocky, and desperate to prove he wasn't someone to be trifled with. That day, his target was Red. I was sitting on a bench, watching from a distance as Travis approached him, spitting insults like a dog barking at a bear. Red, as always, didn't rise to the bait. He kept his back turned, his shoulders relaxed, as though Travis didn't even exist. But Travis wasn't the kind to back down. He grabbed Red by the shoulder, spinning him around. For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in Red's eyes, something cold and dangerous. Then, with a speed I didn't know he possessed, Red grabbed Travis's wrist, twisting it with enough force to make him yelp in pain. The yard went silent. Red leaned in close, his voice low and calm, but whatever he said made Travis's face go pale. Red released him, and Travis stumbled back, clutching his wrist. He didn't bother trying again. I asked Red about it later, but he dismissed it with his usual indifference. "Not worth talking about," he said, turning away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than he let on. The incident might have faded into the background if not for what happened a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside our cell. At first, I thought it was just the guards making their rounds, but the steps were too light, too deliberate. I sat up, straining to hear, and caught a faint rustling sound, like paper being slipped under the door. When I got up to investigate, I found a single envelope lying on the floor. It was unmarked, but when I opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a photograph, grainy and faded, but unmistakable. It showed Red standing over a man, his hands bloody, a knife glinting in the dim light. The man on the ground was barely recognizable, his face twisted in agony. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. Red had always been a mystery, but this was something else. I couldn't decide if I was more horrified by the image or the fact that someone had gone to the trouble of leaving it for me to find. Was it a warning? A threat? I had no idea. The next morning, I confronted Red. I expected him to deny it, to brush it off as a fabrication. Instead, he looked at the photo for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's me." He didn't offer an explanation, and I didn't ask for one. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about the photo. Who had Red killed, and why? A few nights later, I got my answer. It was late, and the prison was quiet except for the distant hum of the generators. Red and I were sitting in our cell, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. I couldn't hold back any longer. "Why did you do it?" I asked. "The man in the photo, who was he?" Red didn't respond at first. He stared at the floor, his jaw clenched, his hands resting on his knees. Then finally he spoke. "He was my brother," he said, his voice low and heavy. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "He wasn't always like that," Red said, his eyes distant. "Growing up, he was my best friend. But something changed. Drugs, bad decisions. He became someone I didn't recognize. And then he hurt someone I cared about." His voice cracked, just slightly, but he quickly regained control. I tried to stop him, tried to help him, but in the end, I couldn't. He didn't go into detail, but he didn't need to. The pain in his voice said it all. Red had killed his brother, not out of malice, but out of desperation. A futile attempt to right a wrong that could never truly be fixed. For the first time in 4 years, I saw Red not as a mystery, but as a man broken by the weight of his own choices. It didn't make him any less dangerous, but it made him human. And in this place, that was more than most of us could say. After everything I had witnessed and endured in prison, the deaths, the madness, the darkness that seemed to seep from every corner, I could no longer deny the truth. This place had changed me. I came here as a murderer, a man condemned by his actions and by society. I had taken a life, and for that, I was cast into this living hell. But in this relentless, unforgiving world, I found something I never expected: clarity. The man I had been was gone, and in his place was someone who longed for redemption. In the early days of my sentence, I clung to anger and bitterness. I told myself I had no choice, that life had pushed me to kill. It was easier to place the blame elsewhere than to confront what I had done. I lived in denial, using the chaos of prison as a shield against my own guilt. But the years chipped away at that shield, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the cold truth. I had killed someone, and no justification could erase the fact that I had stolen a life. At first, the realization crushed me. I felt like a hollow shell, carrying the weight of my crime with no way to atone for it. But as time passed, I began to see that guilt alone was meaningless unless I did something with it. The turning point came during a rare moment of conversation with Red, my silent and stoic cellmate. For years, he had been a mystery to me, a man who lived in quiet detachment. One day, unable to hold back, I asked him if he regretted what had brought him here. Red's response stayed with me. "Regret is worthless if it doesn't change you," he said. "Otherwise, it's just an excuse to feel sorry for yourself." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Regret wasn't enough. If I truly wanted to make amends, not to erase what I'd done, but to honor the life I had taken, I needed to change. Slowly, I began to shift my perspective. I stopped looking for ways to justify my actions and started asking myself how I could live differently. I began avoiding the fights and power games that defined so much of prison life, choosing instead to focus on bettering myself in whatever small ways I could. Books became my refuge. Red had a knack for sneaking them in, and I devoured everything he brought me, from philosophy to history to fiction. They opened my mind to worlds I had never imagined, giving me a sense of hope and possibility that had long been absent. I also started volunteering for programs within the prison, teaching younger inmates, learning vocational skills, and even helping the staff improve conditions for everyone. These small acts didn't erase my guilt, but they gave me purpose. One of the hardest things I ever did was write a letter to the family of the man I had killed. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't expect them to understand. I simply wanted them to know that I acknowledged their pain, that I was deeply sorry for the loss I had caused. I told them about the changes I was trying to make, not as an attempt to excuse myself, but as a promise to never waste the life I still had. I don't know if they ever read the letter, but sending it was enough. It was the first step in a journey toward redemption, however incomplete it might be. Years passed, and I continued my quiet efforts to rebuild myself. When I was called to a parole hearing, I didn't dare hope for leniency. My sentence was 20 years, and I had resigned myself to serving every day of it. But when the judge announced that my term would be reduced to 15 years due to good behavior and efforts toward rehabilitation, I was stunned. For the first time in years, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The day I walked out of that prison was surreal. The air felt different, lighter, freer, yet I was weighed down by the enormity of what lay ahead. Freedom wasn't just about leaving the prison walls behind, it was about learning how to live again. As I stepped through the gates, I looked up at the open sky, unbroken by barbed wire or concrete. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of possibility. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The world outside was a stranger to me, and I was a stranger to it. But I also knew I didn't want to go back to the man I had been. I wanted to build a life that honored the second chance I had been given, a life where I could look in the mirror and not be ashamed of the person staring back. I don't know if redemption is something I'll ever fully achieve. The weight of my past will always be with me, a reminder of what I've done and the pain I've caused. But I've learned that regret, when paired with action, can be a powerful force. It can push you to grow, to strive for something better, even in the face of your darkest moments. As I walked away from the prison, the noise and chaos fading behind me, I felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, hope, uncertainty. But one thing was clear. I was ready to face whatever came next, not as the man I had been, but as the man I was trying to become. This is Chapter 7, which contains intense violent content. Please be aware before listening.
Chapter 7. The Blood Painter. The prison was still reeling from the shadow old Joe had left behind when Jack arrived. From the moment he stepped in, Jack stood out. His piercing eyes, wiry frame, and unsettling smile made it impossible to ignore him. He was assigned to the very cell that had once belonged to Joe, a detail that didn't go unnoticed. Many inmates whispered about the curse of that cell, claiming it had the power to turn anyone who lived there into something monstrous. Jack, however, seemed unfazed. On the contrary, he appeared to revel in the unease his presence caused. It didn't take long for Jack's strange habits to surface. He had an unusual passion for art, but what made it horrifying was the medium he used. Jack didn't draw with pencils, ink, or charcoal. He used his own blood. One morning, during a routine patrol, a guard froze in front of Jack's cell. The walls inside were covered in grotesque imagery, mutilated bodies, hollow eyes staring into the void, and scenes of torture rendered with horrifying detail. The deep crimson lines glistened faintly in the dim light, unmistakably drawn in blood. When questioned, Jack simply smirked and raised his arms, revealing fresh cuts oozing blood. "Art requires sacrifice," he said with a calm, almost serene tone. The prison took measures to stop him. They confiscated anything sharp, but Jack always found a way. He clawed at his own skin, sometimes even biting himself to draw blood. With every new day came another painting, each more complex and disturbing than the last. At first, the guards dismissed Jack's work as the ramblings of a deranged mind. But then, one of his paintings brought everything to a chilling halt. It depicted a man hung upside down, his body covered in deep cuts. The horrifying detail mirrored the rumored death of Marcus, an inmate who had disappeared 2 years earlier. Marcus's body had never been found, but Jack's painting seemed to capture the scene as if he had been there to witness it. The more they examined Jack's work, the more they uncovered. His paintings didn't just reflect events inside the prison, but also unsolved murders from the outside world. Cases that hadn't even been made public were depicted in haunting accuracy. No one could explain how Jack knew these things, but the implications sent shockwaves through the prison. Tensions rose. Jack became a source of dread. He didn't just paint, he whispered things to other inmates, things no one else should have known. One prisoner turned pale when Jack leaned in and murmured, "You thought no one remembered what you did to that girl, didn't you?" To another, he said, "I know where you buried him. The dirt's still under your nails." Jack's words spread fear like wildfire, and soon even the guards avoided him. One night, a scream echoed through the corridors. Guards rushed to Jack's cell and found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, his hands and arms smeared with blood. On the wall behind him was his largest work yet, a dark hallway leading to a heavy iron door with the number 101 etched above it. The door was slightly ajar, and beyond it loomed a shadowy figure. "How does he know about that door?" one guard whispered, his voice trembling. Jack looked up at them, his deep-set eyes gleaming with something almost otherworldly. "Joe told me everything," he said softly, his lips curling into that familiar, unsettling smile. "He paved the way. Now it's my turn." The next morning, Jack was found dead in his cell. He had slit his wrists, using a shard of glass he must have hidden for days. Before he died, Jack had completed one final piece, a self-portrait. It showed him standing before the iron door marked 101, his face adorned with that enigmatic grin. Blood from his wounds had pooled at the base of the painting, as though it were part of the masterpiece. Jack's death cast a heavy pall over the prison. His paintings remained, etched into the walls as if refusing to fade. No one dared to enter his cell, and his name became one more shadow haunting the corridors. Even though he was gone, the terror he inspired lingered, seeping into the minds of those who had seen his work. This prison didn't need ghosts or supernatural forces to be a place of torment. The true horrors were in the people themselves, their secrets, their sins, their darkness. Jack's death didn't bring closure. If anything, it deepened the scars he left behind, ensuring that his twisted legacy would endure.
Thank you for watching the entire video on Rainy Diaries. If you enjoyed the story about James, please let me know so I can share more stories about him in the future. I truly appreciate everyone's support.